That was contemplative, was it not? Hello and welcome to Hermetic Journeys. Obviously, we've got a theme in this particular video. It is the planet Saturn, the magnificent ringed planet Saturn. Now, we're going to look at Saturn's role in this particular emblem, which is emblem number 12 from Atalanta Fugiens by Michael Myers, of course, and illustrated by Matthias Marion. And we're going to look at Saturn's role in Roman mythology, astrology, alchemy, and symbology, and how that all fits together to explain what Michael Myers is trying to convey in this particular emblem, at least what I think he's trying to convey. But it's bigger than that. Saturn plays such a huge role in all these different facets of our lives, as we will get into. It's a really big video. Additionally, a good friend, the alchemist Steve Kalick, is permitting me to show one of his videos on the calcination process. Really, really cool. And of course, you know, Saturn is, of course, related to calcination. And, oh my goodness, normally I have a mystery guest, which is, you know, a historical person, right? But this time we have a special guest. Her name is Maddi Jabin. She's a dear friend of mine who studies Celtic and pagan lore and mythology. And she's going to talk about two things. First, she's going to talk about the Celtic component to this particular emblem, or how this emblem has to do with some Celtic components. Really, really cool stuff. And because I had such great feedback on the Queen Elizabeth section of the last video, I mentioned, of course, Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, cousins, all right, two queens that were cousins. Well, Maddi is going to further elaborate on that relationship, the politics, the crazy stuff that went on back then. You know, it was just insane. So Maddi's going to elaborate on it, and it is so fascinating. It's just incredible. So that's part 2 of this video, so stay tuned for that. So because this is such a big video, I will stop talking and let's take a look at the emblem. This is the picture-perfect postcard emblem in my mind, until you get to the top part of it. That's a whole other story. We see in this emblem a charming church in the foreground. We've got a mountain. And in the distance, we've got a town there with some additional steeples and buildings, things like that, and a beautiful lake or inlet where there are boats sailing. And then our eyes wander to the top of this emblem, and we see a man flying through the air, apparently, with a scythe, holding a scythe there, and he's apparently vomiting up a big stone. Well, what's going on here? This is really, really weird. The motto says, "The stone that Saturn vomited up after having devoured it in place of his son Jupiter has been placed on the helicon as a souvenir for the mortals." Okay, so we know that the person that's flying through the air with the greatest of ease is Saturn, apparently. And the stone that he's vomiting out, he is vomiting, by the way, was supposed to be his son Jupiter. Interesting, don't you think? Let's take a look at the epigram and see what kind of light that sheds on this issue. And this is really funny. This epigram is so colloquial. It's just, and maybe it's the translation, I don't know, but it's really colloquial and kind of surprising for me. And you'll see why. The epigram says, "You want to know the reason why so many poets sing of the helicon and say that everybody must try to reach the top of it? At its summit, a stone has been placed as a souvenir. The stone that was devoured and spit out by Jupiter's father in his stead. If you take these words at their face value, you are out of your senses. For this stone of Saturn is chemical. Wow. So if we take the story of Saturn vomiting up the stone, and we're going to get into that story, by the way. I'm going to further elaborate on it, okay? We're out of our minds, right? Michael Myers saying, if you think this story is real, you're crazy, okay? So let's get to the story, which we will. But first we need to look at a couple of things in here. What is a helicon, okay? He's more than likely talking about a sacred mountain in the region of Boeotia in Greece. It's celebrated in both Greek and Roman mythology, which is kind of cool. It's called Mount Helicon. So why is Mount Helicon sacred, and what does the phrase, you want to know the reason why so many poets sing of the Helicon and say that everybody must try to reach the top of it? Well, Mount Helicon was the home of the Muses. Well, who the hell are the Muses? Well, the Muses were 9 goddesses who were the keepers of poetry, art, and science, okay? And so many poets would look towards the Muses and Mount Helicon for inspiration. What does it mean when Michael Myers says, at its summit, a stone has been placed as a souvenir? Well, in alchemical philosophy, the summit of a mountain or the top of a mountain represents the completion of the effort to create the Philosopher's Stone. So the stone that Saturn has vomited up apparently must be related to the Philosopher's Stone, and I think you've already figured that out, right? And it must be related to the completion of the Philosopher's Stone. In other words, the alchemist has gone through the 3 phases, right, and the 7 or 8 operations, and has come to the completion of the stone. We see the top of a mountain or stone on a mountain. That's what we're talking about here, okay? So what does Michael Myers mean when he says, the stone that was devoured and spit out by Jupiter's father in his stead? Well, to answer this question, we have to take a little journey into Roman mythology. And this is a really disturbing and odd story that I'm going to tell you. And that's why Michael Myers is saying, if you believe the story, you're out of your mind. So essentially, Saturn, which is the topic of this particular emblem, Saturn was the king of the gods. He gets a rather nasty rumor in the form of a prophecy that one of his children will usurp him, okay? Not follow him or succeed him, but usurp him. He has 5 children. And Saturn isn't happy about this. He's really worried that he's going to be overthrown by of all people, his children, right? So what does he do? He eats his children. Oh my God. This is so disturbing. And there are paintings of him eating the children. I'm not gonna show the paintings because they're so awful. They're so disturbing. So that's what he does. Now, Opus, his wife, isn't really thrilled about this, of course, and she's pregnant. So she decides, okay, I've got to do something about this. I'm not going to have him eat my baby, right? He's already eaten 5 of them. It's such a weird story. So what does Opus do? She goes to the island of Crete. And here's a map showing you the location of Crete in terms of Greece and Turkey. And it's there in the Mediterranean Sea. And here's a video of the beaches in Crete. Oh my goodness, if this isn't on your bucket list, you must be out of your mind. So Opus goes to Crete. She goes into a cave. She hides in the cave, and she has Jupiter, her child. All right? Now, Jupiter is raised by a she-goat. He's nursed by a she-goat, and he's raised by a nymph, okay? Opus leaves him in the charge of these 2 beings. Now, upon returning to Mount Olympus, Opus realizes she's got to figure something out. She's, well, I went away, I had the baby, okay? Because Saturn's going to want to eat the baby. So what she does is she takes a big stone and she wraps it in swaddling clothes. And as you can see in this image, she hands it to Saturn, who swallows it, thinking it's Jupiter, all right, his son. Yeah, so Jupiter, the light of the gods, or, you know, the next king of the gods, right, is brought up in a cave in darkness. And this is a theme that is going to be laced throughout everything we look at here in this emblem. So the light coming out of the darkness, okay? Keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about this. Now, when Jupiter becomes a man, he returns to Mount Olympus and confronts Saturn. and he forces Saturn to vomit up his brothers and sisters. And they get together, and of course they overthrow Saturn, which is only normal, right? Because he's crazy. So Jupiter becomes the king of the gods. So Saturn became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, let's think about it. What's the moral here? If Saturn hadn't eaten his children, they wouldn't have rebelled against them. And that also kind of speaks to our force of will, right? And sometimes forcing our will on something in life, on someone or an event or something, it doesn't always guarantee positive results. So Saturn, like many of us, became a self-fulfilling prophecy of we're victims of our own force of will, right? So speaking of will and prophecy, let's take a look at what Saturn represents in astrology. Now we know that astrology and alchemy are intrinsically linked, because if we go back to the 3 videos that I did on alchemy, we talked about how the alchemist needs to harvest, whether it's a metal or a plant, at a particular time of year, when the planetary auspices are correct for that particular plant or metal, because as we know, the plants and metals are related to specific planets. Okay? So astrology is very important in alchemy. Now, whether you believe in astrology or not, I'm going to talk about the influence of Saturn in someone's astrological chart. I'm not an astrologer, of course, but I do need to talk about this, and I think it's kind of interesting too. So when Saturn comes into your astrological chart, it's there to teach you some lessons. In fact, Saturn is known as the stern teacher. Saturn teaches us those life lessons that are particularly tough, but they're necessary. I mean, what are we going through this life for if not to learn? So Saturn will invoke or make those parts of you emerge through circumstances that you don't want to deal with, but you have to deal with them in order to evolve as a human being, right? Saturn, in that sense, concerning life lessons throughout the course of our lives, is known as the planet of karma. Now, karma is a term that comes from Hinduism. And concerning karma, karma has to do with your behavior throughout your lives. Now, karma, if you believe in karma, you believe in reincarnation, because reincarnation tells you just don't have one life to get it right. You got many lives to get it right, because we're pretty hopeless. Right? So essentially, the bad stuff and the good stuff that you've done in previous lives will greatly affect the quality of your current life. And the good stuff and the bad stuff that you do in your current life will greatly affect your future lives. So the idea here is to stop doing bad stuff and just do good stuff, so you won't have to keep being reborn into this world. They call it the cycle of samsara. So you don't want to keep being reborn. You want to become a perfected being. You want to become enlightened. You want to become part of the divine. So that's what happens. Eventually you get it right, like the Buddha, all the other prophets who got it right, and they become part of the divine. Okay? So let's talk about Saturn as symbol, being that we're getting pretty philosophical here, right? And Saturn is represented by many, many things, okay? And Michael Meyer tells us in our first excerpt from the discourse, he says, the allegory of Saturn is explained in various ways. According to the astronomers, Saturn is the last of the planets. In chemical respect, he is the humblest of the metals, lead. The poets consider him as being the father of Jupiter, the son of heaven, but we know that. In mythology, he symbolizes time. So first, of course, back then, in Michael Meyer's time, the 1600s, people didn't know about the remaining planets after Saturn, sorry. They didn't know about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Why? Well, you can't see them. They're too far away. And even the telescopes they had then, the telescope developed by Galileo and Newton's telescope, people were still not able to see them. They couldn't see far enough. They weren't sophisticated, big enough to see that far. So people didn't know about them. So as far as everybody was concerned in the 16th century, Saturn was the last planet. course, I also considered the moon and the sun as planets as well, right? He's also a symbol of truth, Saturn, and Michael Meyer tells us this in excerpt number 2 here. It is not explained why he is called the inventor of truth, why he wields scythe and serpent as attributes. It is thought to be explained as follows. Time reveals the truth and produces it from darkness. Essentially, what Michael Meyer is saying here is the light of truth over time emerges from the darkness. Okay? And that's really important. Again, alchemically as well, and you'll see how it links up with this particular emblem. Speaking of emblems, I want to show you an emblem. It's actually a woodcut of the cover of the book called The New Atlantis that was written by my favorite historical person of all time, Sir Francis Bacon. And you can just ask anybody who's talked to me about anything, and they'll tell you, yes, Tony talks a lot about Francis Bacon. So he is my favorite historical person. Now, let's get to this emblem. It's really cool. As you can see in this image, we have Father Time. All right, we know it's Father Time because if we look at the bottom below his legs, we see an hourglass. And he's got a scythe and wings and all that stuff and a long white beard and, hoofs. And he's holding a naked woman with a crown on emerging from a cave. Well, that naked woman represents truth. In fact, the Latin, as you can see, the Latin that's rimming this image says, tempore patet occulta veritas, pardon my Latin, which translates as hidden truth brought forth by time. This emblem demonstrates what Michael Meyer is revealing to us in the previous section of the discourse. Isn't that cool? So there's this really cool parallel here between what Michael Meyer is saying and what Francis Bacon is saying. This is a huge component to Francis Bacon's philosophy in a lot of his work, The Great Instauration, all these wonderful books that he's written concerning bringing the truth out of the darkness of a cave, okay? And in alchemy, the alchemist is bringing the light out of the darkness through the calcination process. We're going to get to that in a minute. So let's take a look what Michael Meyer says in excerpt number 3. The masters of chemistry have the following explanation about Saturn. Saturn is the first to be present and is proof of the beginning of the truth, having been found, for nothing comes into being without blackness. So what is he saying here? Well, if we think about the 3 phases of the alchemical process, the black phase, the white phase, and the red phase, you can't have the philosopher's stone without one of those phases. Certainly the black phase, which includes calcination and fermentation and putrefaction, right? Those 3 things, those 3 operations are part of the black phase. You can't have the philosopher's stone without calcining your plant or your metal or whatever you're working with, right? Right? Essentially, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, right? And the English theologian Thomas Fuller has a famous saying. It is the darkest hour is just before the dawn, right? So we can think back on some of the other things we were talking about concerning Saturn in your astrological chart, okay? Where it comes in and it teaches you these lessons. It's the darkness. But then comes the dawn, the awakening, the revelation, the epiphany, right? After you've gone through that terrible experience. Or Saturn can also bring you a good experience too, right? That teaches you something. It's not just all bad, okay? So, speaking of emerging from the darkness, so without any further ado, here's Maddi.
When Tony first showed me this emblem, what struck me the most was the idea of this woman coming out of the cave, truth coming to light, and it reminded me very much of a Celtic legend that I'd like to share with you. The images that you're going to see are from the Avalonian Oracle deck by Jenna Telendrew, illustrated by Emily Brunner. Rhiannon is one of the 5 Welsh goddesses of the Celtic pantheon. Her name means Great Divine Queen, and she represents manifestation, the mother aspect of the goddess. Rhiannon's story is told in the first branch of the Mabinogion, a book of ancient Welsh tales. Her lessons? 1. Ask for what you need. 2. Know that she will carry you throughout your hour of need. And 3. Commit to living your truth, no matter the short-term cost. We meet Rhiannon as she rides out of the sacred ancestral mound of Gorseth Arbroath, where it is said that if a king sits upon it, they'll either see a wonder or receive a beating. Pwyll, the king, does just that and sees a beautiful woman riding a white mare. He chases her, but can't catch her until he asks her to please stop. She does, telling him it would have been better for his horse had he asked sooner. Celtic women of the time had to consent to a marriage, and she tells him that she is being married to a man against her will. And better still, the man she actually wants to marry is the now delighted Pwyll. At the feast celebrating their upcoming marriage, as was the custom, a man comes in and asks for a boon, and Pwyll agrees before asking him what it was. The man turns out to be Gwal, the man Rhiannon was supposed to wed. Thinking fast, she tells him to return in a year, and he does. At this second feast, Pwyll is prepared and enters as a beggar, asking for enough food to fill his bag. The bag is magical and will not fill unless a man of high birth steps in with both feet. Gwal does this, they close the bag and play badger in a bag, hitting him with sticks. 3 years after the marriage of Pwyll and Rhiannon, she gives birth to a son. That night, the 6 nursemaids wake to find him gone. They smear Rhiannon with blood and scatter dog's bones at her feet, telling her she ripped the baby apart and ate him. She begs them to tell the truth, but they won't change their story. For her punishment, she is to sit at the gate of Arbroath and tell passing visitors her story, then offer to carry them to the court on her back. At around the same time, there's a man named Tiernan who owns a beautiful horse that gives birth every Calanhav, the beginning of summer, the light half of the year. Every time she gives birth, the foal disappears. This particular year, he decides to stay up all night and watch. Sure enough, the mare gives birth to a foal, and a monstrous arm reaches in the window to grab it. He chops at the arm and chases the monster, which some say is an enormous badger, down the road. Returning home, not only does he find the foal is safe, but he also finds a baby wrapped in fine swaddling on his doorstep. He and his wife take the baby in to raise as their own. I will carry you in your hour of need. The boy grows at an accelerated rate, and upon hearing of Rhiannon's punishment, Tiernan and his wife realize the boy has a strong resemblance to Pwyll. So the family travels to Arbroath, where Rhiannon tells her story and offers to carry them to court, which they refuse. Upon telling the court how they came to have the boy and raise him, all could see he was the son of Rhiannon and Pwyll. When Rhiannon is told, she replies, "If this is true, then I am delivered of my care." She names her son Pryderi ap Pwyll, Care, son of wisdom, and is exonerated and returned to her status as queen. Pryderi grows up to become king and goes on to unify southern Wales with his just rule. Commit to living your truth, no matter the short-term cost. Truth will always come to light.
Wasn't that awesome? I told you she's great. So now we've covered the big picture stuff concerning Saturn. Let's talk about its role in the alchemical process, all right? So as we're learning here, Saturn has to do with the black phase of the alchemical process. We mentioned that. Calcination primarily, right? So what is calcination? Well, calcination has to do with the black phase, of course. It is the breaking down of the prima materia, okay, or whatever it is you're working with, breaking it down to its constituent components, and then it can be purified in the white phase and then recombined in the red phase to create the philosopher's stone or the elixir or the spagyric, whatever you're working with. And thankfully, our good friend Steve Kalick comes to the rescue again, my Obi-Wan Kenobi. Thank you, Steve. He's allowing me to show one of his videos where he's calcining the rosemary herb. It's just really, really cool. And he's going to take you through that process until he arrives at the purified white salts. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. It's so cool. Enjoy. Wasn't that awesome? It's so cool. Thank you so much, Steve. Obi-Wan Kenobi, man. Steve also commented on Emblem 11 in an email to me, and I want to read it to you because what Steve is doing here is he's linking Emblem 11 and Emblem 12 together through the alchemical process. This is really, really cool. So check this out. Here's what he says. The end of my video references the leaching of the ashes with water. And that's the video we just watched, okay? This goes well along with the emblem where Michael Meyer splashes water on Latona to get her truly white. And that's emblem number 11, of course, that we launched previously. My video ends with the whitening salts. This is actually what the emblem is about, the whitening process. We must keep in mind also, in corresponding manner, that there exists in metaphysics the astral salts that also need to be whitened from their gray state by inner calcination through the action of the secret fire, and the purifying through the spiritual water of the spirit. The alchemical process is universal. So in terms of the spiritual component to alchemy, like Steve is talking about, and of course Heinrich Kunrat, Robert Flood, John Dee, and Michael Meyer too, they're very religious people. Christ is also seen, is also associated with the Philosopher's Stone through alchemical literature. In addition to that, his death and resurrection. We talk about a calcination process, right? And then a purification process. In fact, he's also associated with Mercury because, and I know there was a lot of wars fought over this, you know, the divine nature and the human nature of Christ, okay? Just like there is the divine nature of Mercury when it becomes a philosophical Mercury, when alchemists, you know, purify it, it becomes the divine Mercury, and then the gross Mercury, which is the base metal, is that too. So we have this dual nature, just like in Christ. For those of you who believe that, I hope I'm not offending anybody, that, you know, Christ is, you know, is divine and also was a human being, right? So we have the same thing in Mercury. Really, really interesting stuff. So there's a lot of stuff concerning that. You may want to check that out. I find it fascinating. So in the final excerpt concerning Saturn, excerpt number 6, Michael Meyer tells us, the Saturn of the philosophers produces Jupiter. That is to say, he produces the hazy whiteness. Jupiter begets 2 children with Latona. Hey, remember Latona from the previous emblem, right? They are Diana, perfect whiteness, and Apollo, that is perfect redness. Isn't that cool? So we have emblem 11 and emblem 12 kind of being bookends, right? And that's what Steve did. He kind of introduced that concept here, and Michael Meyer tells us in the discourse. So Steve, you're right on the money, of course. So now let's I want to summarize all this stuff we've talked about, and let's go back to the emblem 12, and look at it, and then I'm going to summarize the whole thing here in something that I've written. I hope it all makes sense and brings everything together for you. So Saturn in alchemical philosophy represents the black phase of the alchemical process, which includes calcination and putrefaction. The Roman god Saturn held the stone in the darkness of his belly, and as a parallel, simultaneously, Jupiter, the light of the gods, spent his youth stranded in a cave on the island of Crete. This represents the philosopher's stone that cannot be created unless it begins with the calcination process, exemplified in the 3rd excerpt from the discourse where Michael Meyer states, "For nothing comes into being without blackness." In astrology, Saturn is the stern teacher, and through trials and tribulations teaches us lessons. In symbology, Saturn represents the cave from which light emerges, but Saturn, as Father Time, also brings with him the light of truth. And finally, placing the philosopher's stone at the top of Mount Helicon represents the completion of the alchemical process, as the summit of a mountain is a symbol of the completion of the great work. So there you have it. That's emblem 12. I hope you learned a lot from this. Man, I did. And I know I covered a lot of ground here, but I think it all makes sense, right? It all has to do with this. So without any further delay, let me introduce Maddi to you. And Maddi's going to talk to us about Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, and the people and the power plays that surrounded these 2 queens.
The most interesting thing I find about the cousins Elizabeth I and Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, is that very much like Lincoln and Kennedy, there are so many parallels between them. So before we get into their interaction, let's take a little look at what the court would have been like at the time. To me, the best symbol for the courts of the time is a chess game. Chess was all the rage back then. They did play it as a game, but they lived it as well. So if we look at a typical chessboard, we have the king. He can move 1 square in any direction. He's protected. Take the king out, and you win the game. The queen, on the other hand, can move in any direction as well, but she can go the full length of the board. Keep that in mind. Who are they surrounded by? Well, you've got the bishop. He's a player. You've got the knight. Think of him not so much as the knight in shining armor, although he could be, but think of him more as the lords. These were the guys who could afford the horse to ride. They didn't get muddy on the ground. There's also a rook, the castle. Don't leave this one out. The land, the people, they are a force to be reckoned with. And then you have a line of pawns. They outnumber any one of the other players on the field. So, let's get to Mary and Elizabeth. We kind of heard a little bit about Elizabeth, so my fascination has been with Mary. And yeah, my fascination with her started in a pretty silly way. I got hooked watching the show Reign. Reign was the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, but it was very contemporized, very fictionalized, and my favorite part was, for example, in their wedding, even though it sounded very much like Elizabethan music, it was actually a pop song. But there was something compelling about Mary and her story, and I wanted to know more. So I started to read about her. And this is where I find the duality between the 2 women to be something really, really interesting. So, Mary was basically promised at birth to become the next Queen of France. She didn't spend very much time in Scotland as a child. She was shipped off to the French court to learn to become the Queen of France. Elizabeth, well, her dad, we know him well, Henry VIII. She at one point was disowned, considered a bastard, restored to the bloodline. It's kind of a hot mess on the Tudor side, but it's blood that both women share. Keep that in mind. So off goes Mary, and she is betrothed to Francois. He is a bit younger than her. They grow up together in the French court, and here's the first weird coincidence. His father is Henry. Henry dies after sustaining an injury in some joust type activity where he was trying to prove that he was still vigorously, kingly, fertile, and indestructible. Not so much. So Francois becomes the king. You can see by this portrait that, he and Mary were some young rulers. We tend not to think of them that way because often when we see them portrayed by actors, they are older. But these guys were in their teens. So you think, well, Francois is young, he'll be there, and Mary's young, she'll be there. They'll have lots of heirs, and they'll rule forever. Poor Francois gets sick, he dies. What's the impetus for the royals on this chessboard? What is their value in creating a dynasty? They trade in heirs. So the heir to the throne and keeping their family on the throne, and therefore being taken care of in your dotage by your royal child, was the name of the game for them. With Francois gone, his mother, Catherine de' Medici, knew exactly what was at stake. So she looks at this grieving young widow and says, "Sorry, Mary, you gotta go back to Scotland because I'm going to put my next son on the throne, Charles, and he will take care of me in my dotage because I'm not giving it up." Okay, so off goes Mary, back to Scotland, a place that she hasn't seen since she was a young child. She lands in Scotland. The Catholic lords are all happier than anything to have a Catholic monarch on their throne. But enter one of the bishops. Enter John Knox. He is a preacher bold. He is vehemently Protestant, and he is vehemently against a woman on the throne. Not good for Mary. He has to demonize her. And he does. And Mary looks around and sees the writing on the wall. Literally, there are now posters and things with graphic portraits of her as the French whore, as the Jezebel. She is too young, too widowed, too available, too female. She has the charm of someone who grew up in the French court, and she is, as Elizabeth is, considered a really beautiful woman. So she's the package. She's young, she's of childbearing age, and what will cement her throne? An heir. So she looks around to see who's available, and her eye, being old of something like 25, lights on Lord Darnley. She needed an heir, and she got one. But you see, she's used to playing chess the way the European courts play it. Traditional chess, 2D. What happens in the Tudor courts, they're playing more like the 3D chess that Kirk and Spock played. 3D chess gives you a chance to be a social climber, and all those little pawns want up. So for the pawns, what are they trading in? Information. The gossip chains were a-tingling. There were spies everywhere, in both courts. And this is where you realize that as much as this is a 3D game, the king or queen, both queens in this case, can be just as easily taken out by a pawn as they can by one of the other bigger, stronger players. Think about the knight for a second, because these lords are going to play in here. If you think about the moves, and I'm not a chess player, but I know how they move. He, I believe, goes 2 squares forward, and then he makes a turn. And turn they did. They turned toward whichever side, whichever way could get them up another level in this 3D chess and keep them from getting downplayed. So, into all this mess, we drop these 2 ladies. They both have different ways of dealing with keeping their own thrones. One has the heir, a male heir. The other one is promising an heir, which is why Elizabeth had to remain so youthful looking. She had to. It was part of her game plan. More parallels among these 2 ladies. So they both get involved with some really, really messy dealings. Trying to keep their thrones, trying to remain the monarch, and not have to give it up to the king beside them. Both of them had this challenge. Enter the pawns. Here come the little chatterers. And they take Darnley, who, honestly, well, you be the judge. Pretty face. No accounting for taste. Empty head. Big ego. They start to wine and dine him, and wine him again. His public displays of drunkenness, debauchery, and all sorts of stuff start to become public knowledge. He starts to become a big embarrassment. He has to go somewhere somehow. They try talking to him, they try straightening him out, and this literally blows up when the house that he and Mary are sleeping in suddenly explodes due to some barrels of gunpowder somehow placed in the basement. This is one of the mysteries. What we end up with is a messy death. The messy death of Darnley. Okay, he's out of the picture now, but now Mary is once again widowed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Elizabeth has a little mess on her hands herself. Her relationship with Dudley is pretty well known, and now suddenly there's the messy death of Dudley's wife, who was also a spousal impediment here. She suddenly falls downstairs. Rest in peace, Mrs. Dudley. The poop that spread from this little mishap splattered on Elizabeth and also on Dudley himself. Who pushed her? Did they push her? Was it a natural death or not? Who killed Lady Dudley? Well, Elizabeth was able to whitewash her shoes, but not so much Dudley. And now, as much as she may have wanted him, he was no longer marrying material. He couldn't be king with this stench of wifecide around him. When Mary landed in Scotland as a Tudor cousin, Elizabeth looked at this as a good thing, as a gesture of family, of don't forget, we're blood relatives, please don't come across the border and raid my country. She sends Mary a ring, a little diamond solitaire, and says to her, if you ever need me, show the ring and I will come to your aid. She runs south, presenting her ring to Elizabeth. Mary is now in England saying, help me, and Elizabeth now has a problem on her hands. On her soil is a charismatic, younger by about 8 years, I believe, fertile queen with an heir who is also blood of Henry VII. She also has a claim to the English throne. And the pawns start chattering again. Now, Elizabeth is looking at Mary not so much as an ally, but as a threat. And as these spy networks encircle the two women and start the chatter and the talk and the clumping together, what starts to happen is they maneuver these two queens into an impossible situation. Mary winds up being kept. Prisoner wasn't the first word they used. She actually used the word when she realized that she was not free to roam about the cabin. She was held in castles that were strategically placed. You couldn't put her too close to the south. That puts her too close to London, to the people. And wherever she went, people liked her. So she was a little bit of a danger, because enter the rook. People liked her. And there were Catholics in England. Catholics who were angry that the abbeys were destroyed and taken over and made into estate houses to create a bunch of lords to protect this new Protestant throne, the throne created by Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth. So there's all that going on. The two queens become opposing monarchs on this chessboard. One the Protestant, one the Catholic. And as soon as religion came into the picture, there was no turning back. Elizabeth did not want to kill Mary. She thought, as Mary did, that taking the life of a monarch was completely wrong. She also knew that if she did this, history would judge her forever. And it kind of does. Mary thought her job as a crowned queen, which she was to escape, to return to her throne and take her royal duty, her God-given royal duty, back. And that was the game of cat and mouse that began. Both women were intelligent, both were well-spoken, both had spy networks. Mary was a code creator and a code breaker. She coded messages into embroidery on shirt sleeves, on collars, on pillows, and sent these out under the noses of Elizabeth's spies. Over the course of 20 years, Mary is kept in one castle or another. In this 20 years, finally, some of the players at Elizabeth's court change hands, and this is where you get the Cecils and the Walsinghams. And the people who are losing patience with Elizabeth, her MO was always to sit back and watch and strategize and not get her hands dirty. This was frustrating these men around her, and they create a plot. They now put Mary, who by now, 20 years in these substandard locations, has developed all sorts of rheumatism and arthritis. She's not the young 20-something anymore. She is now in her 40s, and she's not well. The rooms were damp. It really affected her health, and she knew, because this was really a jail. She wasn't even allowed writing paper. She couldn't send messages out. And what they do is they find a child, Babington. He was just fascinated by this glamorous princess and wants to help her escape. And he is the one who kind of gets caught in by these power brokers. And they tell him, we've got a way for her to get messages in and out. There is the barrel maker who brings in the wine or whatever it is, the ale that they drank in the household. And he is willing to create a little compartment in the barrel that we can slip messages in and out of. Mary is delighted because it's her only link to the outside world. And she jumps at it the way she always does, impetuous, French, romantic. And this is where the trap closes. She doesn't even realize that she is in check from one of the other levels of this chess game around her. In it, these messages are now going back and forth, and one finally says, we have a way out of this, but you're not going to like it, because part of it involves a plot to take out Elizabeth. Mary's horrified. Like Elizabeth, she would never think of harming another monarch. But she's desperate, and she wants this to be over. Mary signs this note. This note that is a sting operation created by two of Elizabeth's counselors. In the end, Elizabeth is forced by these pawns moving around her. She is manipulated into finally having to sign this death warrant. And what happens is she creates a martyr for the faith. She was not allowed a public execution, although she had a few people there, and it was kind of botched. She was not beheaded by sword, which was fitting to someone of royal birth. She was beheaded by axe. The first blow bounced off the side of her head and did not kill her. When she was finally beheaded, what they found is when her head was raised up to the small crowd that gathered, they grabbed her by the wig, and her head actually falls out of the wig and blindfold. And what they saw was just a middle-aged woman. She was 44. Someone who died in her faith. From under her skirts, her little dog ran out. He would not leave her body. He circled it. The little dog, faithful to the end, actually bit the jailer. So what happens after? Elizabeth is devastated. She has now killed a royal. And in probably the final irony, the two queens, Mary and Elizabeth, are buried in Westminster. They are buried across the aisle from each other, not facing each other, toe to toe. So they spend their eternity split by a few feet as they spend their lives. Sad. And I really do wonder what would have happened if these two power players, these two women, had been able to speak, to work it out. That's just a mystery for the ages. So who won? Elizabeth basically won this round because Mary was dead. And yet, by killing a royal, Mary actually wins the battle. She is thought of today as a martyr for her faith. The last two pieces on this 3D chessboard are two queens, separated by one square. Neither really won. Check and mate.
Thank you, Maddi. That was awesome. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Maddi's YouTube channel is called The Pagan Next Door. All right, definitely check it out. She incorporates knitting into pagan and Celtic lore and history, and she uses different kinds of tarot decks. It's so fascinating and it's so unique. Definitely check it out. Thanks again, Maddi. So now let's look at the music to Emblem 12. Of course, I downloaded the MIDI files from Adam McLean's wonderful website, the alchemywebsite.com. And in addition to that, I've used some different instrumentation to reflect the outer space nature of Saturn. And the imagery is taken from a variety of NASA spacecraft, like the Cassini mission and all that stuff. It's really, really cool stuff. So please enjoy the music to Emblem 12 and our magnificent ringed planet, Saturn. Okay, thank you very, very much for watching and listening to the lovely music to Emblem 12. It looks like that's the end for this particular emblem. I'd like to say farewell, but not goodbye. Thank you to everyone who watches, continually watches. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And next time, we'll take a look at Emblem 13. Going to be a very interesting emblem. Well, they all are, aren't they? Until then, be safe, be well, be happy, have fun, make the best of this, and have a great day, okay? See you next time.